The Democratic presidential primary campaign begins tomorrow in South Carolina for the first time ever. The vote may be an important test for the support of President Biden, especially with black voters who helped revive his campaign 4 years ago.
Former President Trump has been courting black voters.
Often overlooked voting bloc, African-American men.
We do not talk enough about trans Americans, especially African-American trans Americans.
It's my commitment to fighting for LGBTQ equality.
Suburban women get a lot of attention when it comes to voting.
Both parties are trying to appeal to so many women.
Women voters who chose Trump in 2020. Women are worried.
Women are particularly hard hit by this.
Women are facing economic and real health care woes.
Focusing on another key voting group, and that's Latino voters.
The number one issue for Latino voters.
Just how important jobs and the economy are to Latino voters.
Few things get as much attention during election season than the question of how will X group of non-white male voters vote? In what way is this or that group trending?
These voters could be key to understanding where the nation's electorate is headed.
You might remember during the 2020 election, there was a seeming increase in the number of black men in particular who voted for Trump.
There's been a shift among black voters in recent years moving towards the Republican Party. About 1 in 5 black men voted for Donald Trump in 2020. That's up from 2016.
In the subsequent election, I believe it was the midterm election, there was a lot of buzz over whether or not black men will continue to trend toward the Republican Party.
We cannot make assumptions about whether they'll lean liberal or conservative.
And for this reason, a lot of Democrats were making special appeals to black men, even going so far as to berate them for daring to vote for Republicans.
Abrams blamed her flailing poll numbers on misinformation, specifically targeting black men.
Unfortunately, this year, black men have been a very targeted population for misinformation.
There is some number of black men that will just refuse to vote. It's the sexism, it's the patriarchy that just refuse to vote for a woman, whether that woman is Stacey Abrams or whether it's Hillary Clinton.
You feel ignored, and then you go over to the other side. The oppressed feel oppressed, so then you go and try to align with the oppressor. Sometimes it's like, well, some of you Kevin Samuels following people, please look at the truth and see what's happening and get in line with some of the black women.
I get the question a lot of, how do the Republican Party, or how can the Republican Party appeal more to black voters? And that's an interesting question. Full disclosure, I am not a Republican, although I do tend to vote conservative. But I must say, or I'll be remiss if I didn't, that when it comes to politics, I am not one who believes that the answer to life's questions are found in a political answer. A lot of the solutions to the problems that we have as people can be solved or resolved in the private sector. But the fact is, we have ceded so much to government, and I hope to get to some of that not only later in this talk, but in other talks as well. But when it comes to the question of, how can Republicans or conservative policymakers and thinkers and politicians reach black voters? I think that's an interesting question for a number of reasons, because you can't answer the question without first dealing with the issue of identity.
That margin of people who can be plucked away from your people and go advance policies that harm your people, I just don't understand that.
How can the Republican Party, which claims to be conservative, appeal to people who believe that they are a marginalized people? That's a very interesting question that I hope people will think a lot about.
Democracy that this country is founded on, freedom and justice and life and liberty to all, it was never intended for the black body.
This idea of blacks identifying as oppressed people, it's important to understand and realize where that comes from, where this notion comes from. It's a very Vladimir Lenin-esque way of thinking and identifying. You can find Lenin writing as early as 1928 that in the United States, the Negroes must be classed as an oppressed nation. This has ramifications on how black people see themselves within the political landscape. In many ways, Lenin did pioneer a way of thinking about politics and economics that persists to this very day. And so this question of identity and how one identifies is extraordinarily important. And I think that there is an important difference to distinguish between a worldview that is postmodern and the Christian worldview. On the question of identity, we can clearly see from Vladimir Lenin's thought process, as well as from the cultural Marxist tactics that will come from the Frankfurt School later on, and would ultimately come once again from the Marxian intellectuals of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, who opined about intersectionality and using marginalized status to push for political change. We can see in all of that the postmodern worldview is one that really insists upon starting and leading with your oppressed or marginalized state within the political framework.
For all of you that have aspirations of running for office, for whatever lived experience and identity that you represent, if you are not prepared to represent that voice, don't come. We don't need any more brown faces that don't want to be a brown voice. We don't need black faces that don't want to be a black voice. We don't need Muslims that don't want to be a Muslim voice. We don't need queers that don't want to be a queer voice. Now is not the time to be territorial about oppression and trauma, because this is a coordinated, systemic attack, and we are all losing. But the good news is, we can all win.
This postmodern or Marxian worldview is very different than a Christian worldview of how one must identify. We read about it in 1 Peter chapter 2, where it says, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." And so what these worldviews do when it comes to identity is two completely different things. What postmodernism or Marxism does is it inebriates you with the intoxication of victimhood such that you cannot judge the world or its happenings clearly. You are more susceptible or gullible or credulous to anything that's being peddled without having the discernment or judgment to make the right decisions either for yourself or for your community. Whereas with a Christian worldview, it brings about a degree of sobriety, where you're able to judge more rightly the world and its happenings. For example, under the postmodern or Marxist worldview, you will often hear them say that the fact that there are more blacks incarcerated than other ethnic groups is proof that our justice system is racist. What we need to now do is to redefine crime so as to not incarcerate so many black folks.
We can get rid of all the crime in America overnight. Just change the definition of crime.
It sounds like we're criminal, though.
Yeah.
Our existence is
the culture.
criminal.
But they made the laws. They make the law to criminalize our culture, to fit us. Black culture.
On the other hand, someone who is more sober-minded would understand that you actually need to have tough on crime policies for the sake of civility and stability in your community. And to the extent that individuals of one ethnic group or of one culture are more incarcerated than another, within that framework of law and order, it may have more to do with the cultural differences than some kind of systemic oppression.
When people start talking about racial justice, I say, okay, let's back up. Tell me how you're defining injustice. And then when they say, well, we're defining injustice as disparate outcomes, right? And these outcomes only exist because of the racism that's baked into the system. And so we've got to go and deconstruct this and fix these disparate outcomes. I call it chasing ghosts.
Yeah.
So that's what I want to know. You tell me what the injustice is, and then I'll tell you whether or not I'm going to partner with you in order to correct that injustice. Because what you're defining as injustice may not be injustice at all.
And so how one identifies or how one sees oneself is one of the most important things about them, because it's an indicator in how they move through the world, how they vote, such and so forth. An example of this is the fact that Cato Institute conducted a study in 2018 where they asked different ethnic groups whether they favor capitalism or socialism. And blacks had a more favorable view of socialism than they did capitalism. And so when I look at those numbers, to me, they are indicative of years upon years of political efforts.
The Negro still is not free.
To identify blacks as an oppressed class. And when you identify as an oppressed class, you are more prone to be embracing of revolutionary politics, i.e. socialism, than you are any degree of free market capitalism that's based upon a meritocratic system. If you believe that, well, our system doesn't truly reward merit, because if it did, then there wouldn't be as many black folks in prison. If it did truly reward merit, then you wouldn't have as many white billionaires and all the things that the so-called left says. And so because a lot of blacks believe the narratives that are put forth by leftist social engineers, they are thus more likely to vote for candidates who are propagating a revolutionary brand of politics.
Black folk were oppressed, and when the people are oppressed, they rise up. When the people are oppressed, they resist and they protest. You are living in a time now where some of your rights are being threatened, but do not be silenced.
I do not think that we would have been able to have a Biden-Harris ticket if it weren't for Black-led organizations and Black organizers. From the very beginning, we understood that we were going to have to get Black people out to vote, and we were going to have to push Black folks to make sure that we voted for the Biden-Harris ticket.
And so to circle back to the question of what Republicans must do to reach more Black voters, the reality of it is, if they really genuinely wish to reach more Black voters, they're going to have to do one of two things. They are going to have to either invest a lot of money and time and effort to really get into the culture and shift the identity of Black folks. They're going to have to really propagandize a new identity, a new image of how Black folks see themselves.
9-year-old Isaiah continues.
Because if it is true that most Black folks see themselves as oppressed, as marginalized, then it's going to be very difficult to appeal to them with a conservative politics. If they aren't willing to do that, then they're going to have to do something else, which is to change their own politics. They're going to have to try to beat the Democrat Party at a game that the Democrat Party has already proved to be masters at, namely pandering to the marginalized identity of Black folks. And so it becomes a race of who can pander most to a people who believe that they are marginalized. And in many ways, you see this happening already.
I am far better for women. I am far better for gays.
Nobody has done more for the Black community than Donald Trump. Criminal justice reform, prison reform, opportunity zones.
What you see them doing is significantly watering down any vestiges of genuine conservatism that still exists in their politics because they wish so badly to broaden their so-called tent.
Trump is actually one of the most pro-LGBT presidents we've ever had.
The Black community was not with Trump, you know what I'm saying? But when that PPP shit and all that shit came out, Black people forgave him.
Because he helped out?
Yeah. I'm speaking on the motherfuckers in the hood and shit in the streets. Let them tell it. You feel me? This is what they say.
Yeah.
Biden ain't did nothing for us. That nigga Trump was passing out money.
At first, people was with him like they thought he was racist, saying little and, you know, against women. But once he started getting Black people out of jail and giving people their free money, oh, baby, we love Trump. We need him back in office.
Unfortunately, when you look at a lot of the hip hop artists who, over the course of the past year, have came out in support of Trump or have hinted at the fact that they may be voting for Trump, and you listen to their reasoning, you'll find that it's always because they believe that Trump or the Republican Party are giving them something, which again goes back to the poll that I cited, where Black folks are more in favor of socialism, i.e. getting something from the political system or from the taxpayer.
You see black men complaining about the Biden administration, Democrats in general, because they made all these soaring promises to get elected, and then now that they're in office, they're doing for every other group except for black people.
Black men were not happy with Obama. They felt he should have done more because on the issue of economics, of criminal justice, and things along those lines.
Black people are becoming fed up with it. So if the Democrats don't get it together, this trend is only going to continue.
And so when it comes to the fact that there are black folks who are trending more to the Republican Party, yes, in some instances, it's because that some of these blacks genuinely feel that conservatism is better than leftism. But by and large, what you find is that many of these blacks are merely upset that the Democrats are not giving them enough stuff. And perhaps it's time to vote for Republicans, because we do see some examples of Republicans who are promising to give us stuff. And so with that being the case, once again, it's Republicans who are more interested in looking more like their political adversaries than they are in really going on the offense with genuine conservative ideas, genuine conservative policies. Now, having said all that, I do wonder about the alternative. What might it look like if Republicans did suddenly gain the interest in doing the work of getting more involved in the culture with the purpose or the agenda of helping to shift how blacks identify? What might that look like? I will say this, as unfortunate as it is that Democrats or leftists or progressives or whatever you want to call them have dedicated so many years to doing just that, have dedicated so many years of beating it into the heads of black folks that you are oppressed, you are a victim, you are marginalized, it's the white man's fault, it's the system, it's systemic racism. Look at the disparities, look at the gaps, look at the wealth gaps, look at this gap, look at that gap. It's because of racism, the wealth gap, systemic racism, power, privilege, this, that, and the third. We all know their agenda. We all know what they've been doing for the past 100 years. So we know that they've been doing those things. What will 100 years of conservative talking points do as far as identity is concerned? The reality is, I'm less interested in Republicans or conservatives taking on that task as I am in seeing Christians, genuine fundamentalist Christians, take on that task of instilling into not only black folks, but all ethnicities of people an identity that's rooted in the gospel, more so than an identity that's rooted in some kind of political ideology. Do I believe that conservatism is better than leftism when it comes to the economy and social framework of a country? I do. Yes, I do. But ultimately, what we've seen over the past 200 years as it relates to partisanship, Republican and Democrat, is that both parties are a far cry from their ideological roots. And the reason for that is because as the times change, so do the parties. The parties reflect different issues that come up in a given era. But God's word doesn't change at all. It's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so if it is my goal to see a society of people who are principled, who are virtuous, who are honorable, the way that I think that is achieved is by preaching Christ and Him crucified, and preaching salvation and encouraging people to follow Christ as Lord. There's more virtue in doing that than in pushing some kind of political ideology, which is subject to shape-shifting as the days go by.